We are back on Inside Politics. Our guest today, Dr. John Weil of Middle Tennessee State University, history and political science professor there and dean of the Honors College. Dr. Weil, to go back to politics now, to look towards the elections, this week it became pretty clear that Joe Biden, the former vice president, will be the Democratic nominee. That being the case, he's been in kind of a tough position to stay out inside, at least in terms of the public's mind. All the things going on in the virus have been focused on the administration and on President Trump. Has it hurt Joe Biden to be sort of out of sight, out of mind?
You know, the polls currently show that if the election were held today in a direct contest between the two, that he's winning. So I'm not sure that it is. I do think that Trump got an initial boost. I think we've discussed before, there's something known as a rally around the flag effect that often happens, 9/11 attacks or some kind of catastrophe where the president is seen as the leader and everybody sort of rallies around him. Trump almost seems to have tried to convert the press briefing into sort of a campaign stop. And initially it gave him a little bump, but it doesn't appear to be as big a bump as many of the predecessors have had. And frankly, some of his aides right now seem to be telling him that he's doing more harm to his image than good. I'm not sure that every time somebody thinks about coronavirus, if they think about Donald Trump, if that's necessarily a good thing, particularly if they happen to have lost a loved one or, gone through the virus themselves.
With Bernie Sanders dropping out of the race this week, in favor now, it looks like, of Joe Biden being the Democratic nominee, he did sort of a strange thing. He's leaving his name on the ballot on any of the primaries that still come up. It's a question about whether those primaries are going to happen or not. But that being the case, doesn't that sort of send a signal to his supporters who didn't come over and support Hillary Clinton 4 years ago that maybe they ought to do the same thing, sit on the sidelines with Joe Biden?
I'm not sure. It seems to me that, when some of the other candidates have dropped out, Klobuchar and Buttigieg and the others, that the same thing happened. In some states, it might be relatively difficult to remove. I mean, the one thing you can obviously say, if you think back to Bloomberg, he was going to be all in no matter what happened. But once he spent $1 billion or so on himself, he did transfer $20 million or so over to the Democratic Party, but nobody's going to be as excited about their own about somebody else's election as they are their own. It does look like Biden is making, some efforts. I noticed just this morning he changed his education policy to deal with, in part at least, with student debts, which is something that Biden, Sanders has supported. A lot of it may come down to, the only real question we're going to have in the convention, absent some kind of health, scare with one of the candidates, is on the Democratic side at least, is who's going to be the vice president. And I think Biden may have made a mistake in saying that it would absolutely be a woman, because if it weren't, you'd have a couple other people that you could be talking about. But, even among women, there are 4 to 10 relatively good choices that he could make, and that, some have more regional appeal than others. Some might balance the ticket ideologically. So there'll be a fair amount of interest in that, I believe.
So what men would you put on his list to go along with the women? Well,
it looks like maybe Kamala Harris has a good chance. My own favorite probably would be Amy Klobuchar. I'm trying to remember the woman who ran for governor, Stacey Abrams, in Georgia, I think would be a strong candidate. Some of them are African. 2 of the 3, I think, are African American, and that's already a strong base for Biden. It might encourage a few more people to come out. Elizabeth Warren, I suppose, is always a possibility. Be a little like putting the Bernie Sanders on the ticket, not quite. So we'll see.
Is this a situation, people don't generally vote for president based on who the vice president is, but given the age of Joe Biden, might that be a little bit of a difference this time? People might be looking at who the second person is, because that person will have a strong chance to be president, or at least to run for it in 4 years, and maybe even earlier than that, God forbid, if something happened to the president.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Sometimes choice of a vice president can hurt you. And give two examples. Bush's selection of Dan Quayle and McCain's selection of Palin are generally regarded as very weak choices that didn't seem to show very good judgment on the president's part. By contrast, I think most Republicans have been pretty pleased with Mike Pence, and in fact, I think a lot of people wish that Trump were a little bit more like Pence. So that you can do yourself probably as much harm as you can good, but regional, in an election that could be very, very close, if you could find somebody who could carry a Minnesota or a Michigan or a Wisconsin, or even a deep South state, if you could turn it from red to blue, that might in and of itself make a difference.
Dr. John Vial, Middle State University, is our guest here on Inside Politics. We're talking about the coronavirus and how it has impacting our politics. Back to continue our conversation after this break.